Now she digs. Not out of necessity, nor ritual, nor madness. Just the kind of stillness that eventually needs a shape. The woman had walked out to the edge of her land, if it could be called that, just past the dry mesquite and the broken fence, to the place where the wind didn't hum so much as it hovered, thick and stale. She didn't wear black or carry flowers or mark the earth with anything but the soft scrape of her shovel. Each dig was small, careful, not because the earth was sacred, but because she didn't want to disturb the silence she had spent so long building around her life. The sand didn't resist. Not really. It was the kind of ground that gave way easily, like an old memory being unearthed. And that's what it felt like. She wasn't burying anything. Not yet. She was remembering what it would feel like to leave. The grave wasn't for someone else. It wasn't marked. It wasn't named. It was simply hers. Not in ownership, but in intention. As she worked, the sun sat still in the sky, like it was watching. A low wind picked up and caught the edge of her shawl, but she didn't pause. This was not a moment for ceremony. She dug because there was no one left to grieve, no funeral to attend, no preacher to lie kindly about what kind of woman she had been. The land, with its rust-colored dirt and brittle weeds, had already accepted her in pieces, her hair in the brush, her skin in the dust, her voice in the distance where no one heard it but coyotes and wind. Her arms ached, but not in protest, just memory. She dug as if she had done this before. Perhaps she had, in dreams. Perhaps the shape of the grave had always been waiting in her. When she stopped, she didn't step back to admire the work. There was nothing to admire. Just a long, shallow hole that would be lost to the desert by morning if the wind changed its mind. She sat beside it, not like someone resting, but like someone who had finally arrived. The silence around her didn't feel empty now. It felt like company. Not warm, not cold. Just real. She let the shovel fall beside her and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to see better. The kind of seeing that only happens when everything is still. The ground no longer seemed to belong to the earth. It was part of her now, or she was part of it. She thought of names, not her own, but those she never said aloud. The people she used to imagine might visit. Then she let them go, one by one, like dust blowing off a stone. And when the stars began to edge into the sky, she didn't look up. She only reached out, traced the rim of the grave with her fingers, and whispered nothing at all. Because some graves don't need words, just the quiet understanding that you might lie there one day, not be alone anymore. She dug without rhythm, not because she lacked strength, but because the earth did not call for haste, invited her slowly, like an old house opening one creaking door at a time, and every time the shovel pressed down, something from the past pressed back, not in defiance, but in quiet recognition, as if the dirt itself had kept a record of all the moments she thought she had buried in other ways. And now, with each scoop, they returned not as ghosts, but as echoes, warm and unfinished, threading through the veins of the desert-like forgotten roots. And she could not say whether it was the effort or the remembering that slowed her, but her hands paused often, not in pain, but in reverence, as if she were uncovering the outlines of a life rather than shaping a hole for its end. Because this place, this stretch of sand and sky, had heard her name once, and once had held her voice. And now it held her silence, thick and shaped like absence, but not empty. And when the blade of the shovel hit a small stone, she didn't flinch, only knelt down and brushed it with her fingers, finding that even the smallest resistance in the ground could be a sign, a stone, a root, a bone, of something that used to be hers. Maybe not in flesh, but in feeling, and the air around her did not move quickly, but in slow coils, rising like smoke from a fire no one saw. And still she dug, not deep, but wide, as if the space itself mattered more than the depth, and she in detail, but in texture, the people who once walked this land with her, or near her, or never at all, but still existed in her memory like distant lanterns, flickering but fixed, and every time the wind shifted, she felt their names come to her lips, not spoken, only shaped, as if her mouth remembered the weight of them, even if her voice did not. And she wondered if digging here was not about death, but about remembering where her name used to live. In the voices of others, in letters she never sent, in fireside stories that never found their way past the canyon. And as her knees sank deeper into the soft, dry ground, she thought of the weight of blankets once shared, the taste of water when it was rare and cold, the look in someone's eyes when they handed her the last bite of something warm, and none of those things had names anymore. But they had shape, and that shape lived in her arms as she raised the shovel again and again, not to bury, not to finish, but to remember by motion what her mind had forgotten by silence. And she did not cry, not because there was no sorrow, but because crying belonged to people who still waited for answers, and she had none to wait for. Not from men, not from the sky, not from the bones of the earth. And so she kept going, through the heat and the stillness, until the shadows curled longer, and the sweat dried salt on her collarbone, and still she dug, with the care of someone rethreading the seams of her own spirit, one silent stroke at a time. And the sun watched without blinking, and the desert held its breath, and somewhere beneath the surface, the ground no longer asked why she was digging, only welcomed her hands, as if the land itself was waiting to be remembered by her, and only her. Let the dust settle in your lungs like it does in hers. Then if you're listening under the moon, or far away where the sky is quiet, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let's trace a map of still hearts in silent places. And if the silence speaks to you, consider subscribing, so these slow stories always find their way to you. The days passed without names, without sound, stretched thin like the horizon where the sun rose not in glory, but in obligation. And the woman moved through them not like a figure of purpose, but like smoke rising from an old, dying fire, each step leaving behind no mark but the faint awareness that she had walked there at all. And in this silence she had found a rhythm, not one of life, but of drifting, as if time were a low and distant hum, almost inaudible, just beneath the skin, and she became attuned to it. This quiet pulse of isolation, not resisting it, not embracing it, just floating within it, her breath shallow but steady, her hands engaged only with the most necessary things, the water she fetched, the bread she shaped, the single shirt she mended, not because she cared to wear it, but because things should not fall apart faster than the body that carries them. And when the sun reached its highest point, she would sit, not to rest, but to remember how it felt to do nothing at all. And that, too, became a ritual, simple, uneventful, like the desert itself, wide and full of absence, and in the quiet hours that stretched long between dusk and dark, she would sometimes close her eyes not to sleep, but to see if the silence changed, to listen for something beyond the whisper of sand moving outside or the groan of old wood contracting in the cool night air. But nothing ever came, not footsteps, not voices, not even her own name. And perhaps that was the hardest part, not being forgotten by others, but no longer remembering how her name used to feel when spoken by someone else, someone real, someone warm. And so she wandered within herself as the stars rose, their cold light falling through the cracks in her roof like dust from heaven. And in that light she felt both exposed and invisible, the dual ache of being seen by no one and everything at once. And the night wrapped around her like cloth, not soft, not cruel, just present. And she curled into it with the resignation of someone who no longer fears the dark, but finds in it a kind of company. Not comforting, but constant. And her thoughts, once wild and full of stories, now moved slowly, like cattle too tired to run, grazing on fragments of old conversations, the echo of a hand on her shoulder, the warmth of soup shared in silence. And she let these fragments drift through her without trying to hold them, because the holding hurt more than the remembering. And so the nights passed, and the days after them, and still she remained, not waiting, not mourning, just existing. In that thin, quiet space between breath and stillness, where the world does not knock, where no one calls, where everything that matters sleeps just beneath the surface. And sometimes she would press her hand to the floor, just to feel if anything still moved below, some vibration of memory, some trace of life. But there was only the cold of wood and the hush of wind and the soft pulse of her own heart, reminding her that even after all this time, she was still here, and that was both miracle and burden. She noticed it before the wind began to speak, before the long note whistle that passed through the brittle grass and over the half-buried stones, before the dust lifted in thin lines like smoke from unseen fires, before the edge of the horizon began to bend not with light, but with something quieter, heavier, as if the desert itself was preparing to breathe in rather than exhale. And in that stillness, long before the moon breached the rim of the earth, she felt the temperature shift first. Not in her skin, but somewhere behind her ribs, like an old song about to begin. And she stopped moving, not out of fear, but out of listening, because what was coming did not announce itself with sound or sight, but with the memory of both, as though every step taken by someone not yet visible had already happened in another time, another dream, and her hands, stained with earth and worn smooth by solitude, hovered above the ground like she was waiting to catch something that would not fall. And all around her the desert grew darker, not with the loss of sun, but with the return of silence, and even the insects quieted, even the birds withdrew. Even the clouds held still in the high, breathless sky, and she could smell something in the air that had not been there since a time she no longer allowed herself to name sweat and leather, smoke and blood, distant fires or old ceremonies, or maybe just the ghost of memory summoned by her digging. And the wind did not come in gusts, but in careful waves, as though it were carrying something sacred or fragile or ancient. And the sand beneath her feet began to cool, and the edge of her shadow stretched longer, thinner, until it merged with the twisted silhouette of a cactus that had outlived generations. And still she stood, alone, still, not blinking, not breathing deeply, because to do so might disturb the delicate approach of something unspoken. And she realized the desert was not empty, was preparing, like a mouth before a whisper, like a drum before a war song. And though she could see no figures, yet no motion beyond the slow crawl of shadow across the rocks, she knew that the hour before the moon rises is when the old spirits stir, when horses lower their heads without being touched, when fires light themselves in memory alone, and she thought of her own shadow moving behind her, stretching across the sand like a question not yet answered. And she wondered if perhaps what she had summoned with her spade was not just her past, but all that had ever passed through this land, the footsteps erased by wind, all the bones broken under silence, all the promises never spoken aloud. And when the air pressed close to her skin, warm and cold at once, she did not step back, did not call out, because there are some arrivals that do not want witness, only presence. And as the last curve of sunlight bled from the rocks and the moon's light hovered just below the sky, she whispered nothing, not even to herself, and waited not for people, not for spirits, but for the moment when the land itself would speak. And in that moment she would answer not with words, but with the quiet that had shaped her bone by bone into the kind of woman who digs her own grave with steady hands and listens for footsteps in the shape of wind. She did not move as night descended, she simply became part of it, like a stone warmed all day by the sun, now surrendering its heat back to the stars. And the wind, softer now, circled her in loops that almost resembled arms, but never touched. And the moon rose without ceremony, wide and quiet and pale like the breath of a sleeping god, casting its glow across the open sand until everything shimmered, not with light, but with memory, and she stood in it without question, without gesture, as though this posture still, upright, silent had been practiced for years in secret. Rehearsals, and though the wind tugged gently at her hair, and the coyote sang far in the distance, and even the ground beneath her feet seemed to inhale, nothing within her moved, not even her thoughts, which had long since folded into the rhythm of the desert's breath, and the shovel once held tight in her hands now lay beside her, forgotten or forgiven, its blade marked with the earth she had disturbed. And in her stance was neither pride nor grief, only readiness, not for battle or surrender, but for something older, slower, something that arrived not in a rush, but in a hush, and the moonlight touched her shoulders as if to say, now is the time, but still she waited. Because what was coming was not bound to clocks or stars, not summoned by need or fear, but by something even quieter. A vibration passed down through silence itself, and though she could not see them yet, could not name or count or define the presence that was slowly folding itself into the landscape, she felt it the way dry earth feels thunder long before the storm arrives. And her shadow lengthened behind her like a second spine, dark and loyal, and the graves behind her shallow or deep, real or imagined, sat undisturbed, their silence now shared, as if even the dead were holding their breath for what would follow. And she stood there, not as a warning, not as a guardian, but as a witness to herself, to the land, to the choice she had made not to flee, not to speak, not to vanish, but to remain, even when remaining meant being nothing more than a shape in the light, a stillness in the dark, a whisper not yet spoken, and around her the desert waited too, not in fear, but in ritual, and above her the moon rose higher, until it carved her figure into silver against the night. And the woman, who had not blinked, not swallowed, not sighed, remained unmoved, because this stillness under the gaze of the moon was not absence, it was invitation. It began so faintly that she mistook it for something inside her perhaps, a memory knocking loose from the walls of her ribcage, or the slow, dull echo of her own blood moving through the hollows of her body. But it grew, not fast, not loud, just deeper, as if the earth was speaking from far below its surface. A low rhythm-like breath dragged across stone, and she turned her head slightly, not in alarm, but in reverence, the way one might tilt their ear toward an ancient prayer they never learned to speak, but somehow still understand. And there it was again, not one sound, but many, though all in unison. A cadence too deliberate for wind, too heavy for birds, too rooted for thunder. And the ground beneath her did not tremble, not yet, but it listened to or braced itself. And she imagined each hoof pressing down in perfect time, not in chaos, but in ceremony. The kind passed down through blood and sand and silence, and she knew it was not just the noise of travel, it was the noise of return, of something promised long ago, arriving not late, not early, but when the land finally allowed it. And her breath caught not in fear, but in stillness, because when something that old begins to arrive, even the body forgets how to move, and the wind, once playful, once searching, now folded back into itself, retreating behind dunes and stones and broken fences, making space for what approached. And though the figures had not yet crested the horizon, she could see them in the mind's eye, dark shapes on dark horses under a pale sky, faces not unknown but unspoken, the kind you remember without meeting, because your bones were built from the same songs. And she wondered if the graves behind her, shallow and unmarked, would recognize them too, would stir slightly at the vibration of their gait, and the moon above, no longer rising but watching, seemed to pulse in time with each muffled strike. And she stood there, not counting the steps, not guessing the distance, just listening as the sound unfolded like a language without. Breath, and somewhere in her chest, something answered not a word. Not a name, but a presence, the echo of belonging or the shadow of consequence. And the sound came closer still, until the silence between hoofbeats became narrower than a breath. And the moment stretched not toward dread, but toward arrival. And she remained where she stood, arms still, eyes dry, waiting for the sound to stop, not because it had ended, but because it had found her. They did not come like a storm, nor like a charge. There was no thunder, no battle cry, no gallop to split the air open, only silence shaped by intention. And from the far edge of the world where night touches horizon, they emerged not all at once, but in rhythm, like notes from an old flute carried across miles of still air, their silhouettes blooming slowly from the dunes. Too smooth to be coincidence, too steady to be dream. And the woman saw them first as a shimmered dark folds, moving against darker sky. 70 riders whose forms flickered in and out of the wind as though they were carved from its very skin. And the dust, which had rested so long undisturbed across the plain, now lifted in thin veils around their feet, catching moonlight like gauze, wrapping around hooves and ankles until the earth itself seemed to follow them forward. And they did. Not speak, did not raise their hands, did not reach for weapons or reins. Only rode with their eyes fixed, not on her, but through her, as if her presence had always been assumed. As if this place, this dry hollow beyond graves, had waited only for them. And she stood still, not in awe, but in recognition, because, though she had never seen these men before, their quiet, measured arrival was the shape her solitude had always pointed toward, and the wind behind her died completely, as if yielding, as if stepping aside for something older than breath. And the riders came forward in long shadows, their faces half covered, their horses breathing slow and deep, as if they too knew this night was not made for noise, and no one dismounted. No. Voice pierced the space between them, but still something shifted in the ground. A recognition passed not in greeting, but in shared memory, and the woman's shadow, stretched behind her, joined the shadows of the horses and the air between. Them shimmered with dust that refused to settle, and in that charged stillness, she remembered every moment she had not been seen, every silence mistaken for emptiness, every hour spent carving space into the world with her hands, and now across from her. 70 silences looked back not with pity, not with demand, but with the stillness of those who understand waiting, who understand loss, not as grief, but as terrain. And she lowered her eyes not in submission, but in welcome, and the wind did not return, and the graves behind her did not stir, and the moon above only deepened its gaze. And the riders stood in the dustlight like sentinels of a story too old to be told aloud, and the desert, wrapped in all their shadows, held its breath one moment longer and listened. They did not speak, and neither did she, but something vast moved between them, the kind of vastness that doesn't stretch outward like plains or sky, but inward, into the quiet places inside the chest where breath hides when it's afraid. To break the silence, and she met their eyes not one by one, but all at once, as if 70 gazes had been woven into one ancient thread pulled tight across the space. And for a moment, there were no horses, no desert, no graves, only the tether between her and them, thin as wind but unbreakable, and none of them flinched, not even the youngest, whose hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, and she saw in their faces no threat, no question, only the same long patience that had shaped her own bones, the same ache of waiting that creaks inside joints and under ribs when years pass like dust over stone. And though their mouths did not move, their silence said everything said. We've come far without knowing why. Said we've followed something that felt like memory. said we recognize the way you stand still, like land that's never been named. And the woman, whose body had become part of the dust, part of the hush. Let her gaze answer back not with welcome or refusal, but with presence, the kind that does not lean forward or draw back, only stays, and the flames between them faint. And flickering from the embers she had lit earlier, cast their faces in motionless gold, softening the lines time had carved, making their silence glow. And though the air was dry, heavy with dust and age, it held something new now, unspoken agreement, forged not in words but in awareness. And the woman saw them not as warriors or strangers but as echoes, echoes of something she had tried to bury with every shovel of sand. Every night slept without speaking, and in that recognition, something settled not in her chest, but in the air itself, like breath exhaled after too many held moments. And no one moved, no one blinked. Even the fire seemed to bow to the stillness. And the graves behind her faded from memory, and the horizon forgot to stretch. And only the silence between eyes remained, full of weight and warmth and things that language could never carry. And for that 1 hour beneath the silver hush of moonlight, 70 riders and 1 woman held still, not as enemies, not even as guests, but as beings who understood that some things must be seen to be shared, and some silences are sacred. They stood together, but not close-spaced, like stones in a forgotten field, like stars that burn quietly in a sky where no one looks up anymore, and between them lay the shallow graves, not marked with names, not claimed by prayer, but shaped with careful hands that had once trembled under the weight of memory, and now only remembered how to move through dust. And the woman did not point to them, did not explain, for nothing needed to be said to those who already knew the silence of loss, and the warriors did not ask, did not shift, did not speak. But their eyes moved softly from earth to shadow, from mound to moonlight, as if recognizing the outline of grief without needing to trace its source. And she felt no shame, only a slow rise of breath she had not noticed holding, because the presence of others did not disturb the graves, it honored them. The way wind sometimes bends to whisper over bones, not to disturb, but to remember. And the earth beneath her feet held the weight of all that had gone unsaid, not heavy like regret, but sacred like ritual. And none of the riders crossed the grave's edge, none touched the soil, but they lingered in the hush around it, in the respectful distance of those who understood that mourning is not always loud, that some farewells are made with shovels and silence. And as the night deepened and the stars withdrew behind a veil of thin clouds, she felt the ground shift not in danger, but in invitation, as if the land itself had opened to receive the company, not just of the living, but of all the stories that traveled with them. And though she had dug those graves to bury her past, what rose now was not ghosts, but a kind of belonging she had not expected, the sense that her silence was not isolation, but shelter. And the warriors, still and solemn, seemed to place their presence there not like a claim, but like a blessing. And the air between them warmed slightly not with fire, but with shared stillness. And when she looked again at the mounds, they did not seem unfinished, nor forgotten, but full, held not by sorrow, but by presence, and the dust that drifted across them did so gently, like fingers closing the eyes of memory. And in that space between loss and witness she stood no longer alone, but among others who did not need the past spoken aloud to honor it. They left without sound, the same way they had come, no farewells, no backward glances, only a soft shift in the morning air as 70 shadows dissolved into the pale horizon, their silhouettes folding into the golden breath of dawn like smoke returning to the wind. And she did not follow them with her feet, only with her eyes, until even the dust they had stirred began to settle, as if the desert itself had exhaled, not in relief, but in reverence. And when the last hoofprint faded from the edge of sight, she turned slowly toward the graves she had dug, their ridges still visible, their silence no longer heavy with loneliness, but softened by what had passed. And she knelt beside them, not in grief this time, not in fear, but in recognition. For the ground that once held only memory now held meaning, not because of who lay beneath, but because of who had stood beside. And the sand that drifted across the mounds did so differently now, not as erasure, but as a covering, a quiet promise that even things unspoken could be held with care. And she traced a finger over one grave's edge, not to mark it, but to feel it, to remember not just who she had been when she dug it, but who she had become by not being the only one to stand over it. And the wind that had once been her only companion now moved around her differently, slower, more full, as if carrying traces of voices that had never spoken but had still been heard. And she sat there for hours, not counting time, not waiting for anything else to come, but listening to the stillness the way one listens to the echo of footsteps after the road is empty. And the fire in her shelter had long since died, but its scent remained, as did the marks in the earth where horses had stood and the curve of footprints near the doorway. And though the graves remained untouched, something had changed in her vision of them. They were no longer endings, but markers of something witnessed, of something shared. And she knew now that she could stay here, not in hiding, not in mourning, but in presence. And she began to gather stones, not to bury, but to shape, to circle each grave in her own quiet way, not as monuments, but as gestures, soft touches of the hand upon the past. And when the wind rose again that evening, it did not howl, did not pull, only pass through gently, as though checking in, and she stood beneath the wide and endless sky, surrounded by sand and memory, no longer preparing to disappear, but to remain. And though the desert spoke no louder than before, she now understood the tone of its silence, the way it welcomed without words and remembered without need for names. And when night returned, she did not light a fire, but she did not feel cold. And the moon rose not as a watcher, but as a witness. And the woman who had dug graves to forget now looked upon them and remembered differently, not as one who had lost, but as one who had been found. And the sand that remained did not bury her, but carried her